Dash here from work.
Well, why don't we get started?
Sure.
Is everybody here okay? I'll be Allison tonight doing the technical check. And then if you have problems, I'll hand it over to Amber very quickly. So everybody can hear?
Yes.
We've got a couple of people, George and Wes, who seem to be on a phone, or if you have the ability to turn on your video, that'd be great. But if not, that's all right. So I think we're ready, Doug.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
kick it off.
Nice to see you all again. Like Catherine said, not since last summer. Well, since summer, whatever that was, and now we're in whatever this is. At the moment, it seems a lot like fall, I suppose. Anyway, we're not going to do a roll call, but I just because this is on recorded, so we'll just, for the record, I'll recognize we've got Gary Bukowski is here, Mike Schmier, always with an intriguing background. Nice to see you, Mike. Mark Elliott, looking handsome and but not so lively, but that's fine. Dennis Hickey, Paul Boundy, Grover Bornefeld. I'm trying to see the other. I'm just identifying task force members. I'll let Catherine take care of the rest. Ron Campbell is here, and Rose Ojeda. I don't think. Hopefully, I didn't miss any other task force members. That looks like that's those of us from the task force. Welcome, everybody. We got digging into the dirt of this whole situation today. Yeah, I came up with that one myself.
That was in your script.
But should be interesting. I haven't had a chance to read the whole report, all 88 pages, but I only got to page 84. But I'd be interested in hearing the Reader's Digest version of it. So
the Cliff Notes.
Yeah. Tell me what it all means. All right, Catherine, I'll let you introduce the others.
Thanks, Doug. First, I'll introduce staff. So who do we have here? We have Mitzi Olson, our librarian. You can wave, Mitzi.
Hello.
We have Ellen Rogalin from Public and Government Affairs. We have Amber Johnson, also Public and Government Affairs, our tech person, among many other things and skills she has.
Yes.
And then we have Scott Archer here. Hey, Scott, Scott, many of you may have heard, is leaving us. We're really sad about that. He's taken a job as the city administrator at Canby, and we're really excited for him, but really sad. You've been such a vital part of this project. You want to say a few things?
Sure, thanks,
I'll try not to cry.
Yeah, don't make me cry. Hey, good evening, everybody. Yeah, this will be my my final task force meeting with you all. As Catherine said, I've taken another professional opportunity. I'll be moving down the road a little ways, helping to lead the city of Canby. So so this will be my last meeting with you all. I'll be wrapping up my service with NCPRD over the next few days here, and then starting my service with Canby in a couple more weeks. I do want to tell you all how much I appreciate the work that you do as well. Those of you that are citizen task force members, how much I appreciate your dedication to this process. We've been meeting and spending a lot of time on this, and of course for us that are working, or consultants that are getting paid, this is our job, and we get paid to do this. Of course, we have a lot of passion for that, but you the citizen volunteers are doing this completely on your own time for service to the community and to the multi phased project that we're doing here in be that the community center, the libraries, the park. Your dedication is to be commended, and this one in particular is very complex. There's a lot of community interest, and there's a lot of excitement. So you all have been very you have been and continue to be very instrumental in the direction of this project. And this project is a game changer for our community, for libraries, for the Park District, for just kind of the general community. And so this was a tough part of my deciding to leave, was not being able to work on this project anymore. And because I think we've got so much, investment on the citizen side and on the professional side. We've got a wonderful team of staff and consultants, and we've all gotten really, really invested in this project, myself included. I guess I would just say, I commend you for the work you've done. Please stay the course and take the work across the finish line. And then as citizen advocates, I encourage you to continue to be supportive of these various projects within the one big project, and just really help push this thing forward so that it gets done. And I would look forward to coming to a ribbon cutting ceremony at the Concord site for a community center, a library, and a park in the somewhat not too distant future. So I thank you all for your support, and I've enjoyed working with you, and I'll be around, and perhaps we'll cross paths in other work around the county with my new role, but I really have appreciated working with you all. So thanks.
Thanks, Scott. I've been working with Scott ever since I came to the county, so it's going to be a big loss for us. We wish you the best.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine.
So I want to introduce our consultants, and then I'll turn it over to Jennifer to introduce her consultants. Okay. So we've got Brian Cook, who's our project engineer, and Greg Martin, who is our, I think you would project geologist, right?
Correct.
And then we have George Freytag, who is our principal geologist. He's
Good evening.
Oh, you're on both video and I got it. And then Wes Sprang, who's the principal of GRI at GRI, also a principal engineer. So they're gonna give us a presentation. We're gonna have lots of time for Q&A, but before we do that, Jennifer, will you introduce the
Yeah, we have a small group tonight. Jim Calvelich is here, and myself. And then we have Jared Lewis with Catena. He's our structural engineer on the project, so he'll be able to address questions in Q&A and be here for the conversation. Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of curiosity and comments and questions about the geotechnical work, specifically the Oatfield Fault, and then also how that might play into the seismic reinforcement of the Concord project. So we put together this optional task force meeting for you. And so the geotechnical consultants are going to share their report. They're done with their work. And then Jared's going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about how he uses that information, and then just a little touch on the seismic and where we are with that. So should I kick it off to you, Brian?
Yeah, that sounds great. Let me go ahead and share my my presentation, if it's all right. There we go. All right, so as Catherine mentioned, my name is Brian Cook. I'm a project engineer with Geotechnical Resources Incorporated, or GRI. A little bit about us. We're a geotechnical engineering firm. We provide geotechnical, geologic, and pavement engineering services, as well as environmental and hazmat consultation. We opened our first office in Beaverton in 1984. We opened up our Vancouver, Washington office in 2008. And we also have branch offices in Brookings and Spokane. We have a technical staff of about 40 people, most of them with at least a master's degree in geotechnical engineering or geology. As Catherine mentioned, our project team for the Concord site is myself, Brian Cook, Greg Martin, project geologist, George Freitag, principal geologist, and Wes Spang, principal engineer. So the work that we've completed already at the Concord site started back in April of 2020. We did a preliminary consultation. Basically, it's kind of a desktop or a research evaluation at the site, kind of looking at the site specifically and the immediate surrounding areas. Really, it kind of allows us to gather and provide some generalized preliminary recommendations. Things that we look at are
you what?
Subsurface conditions, the types of soils that we're likely to encounter at the site. We can provide some general recommendations on the types of foundations that should be used and the associated bearing strata. Additionally, groundwater conditions, as well as geologic hazards. That would include, landslide or slope stability, earthquake, or the potential presence of faults. As you're aware, that the U.S. Geological Survey maps inferred the location of the Oakfield Fault across the southwest corner of the Concord site. So the next step that we proceeded with was a geotechnical investigation and a site-specific seismic hazard evaluation. That work was completed August through October of this year. With that, it's a fieldwork-based investigation and evaluation. We collected subsurface information. We did on-site or in-situ soils testing and sample collection to really further evaluate the potential presence of the Oakfield Fault structure and provide some additional recommendations for design and construction of the proposed site improvements. The field investigation, we completed 2 seismic refraction arrays across the mapped fault location or potential fault location. We completed 3 test pit trenches, 1 cone penetration test, and 3 geotechnical soil borings. From there, I'll turn this over to Greg, our project geologist, talk a little bit about the geologic setting.
All right, thanks, Brian. So just to give a quick background on the geology of the Concord school site, which is shown generally by this red star. The site itself is mapped as Missoula flood deposits, which are a sedimentary unit, generally thought to be about 15,000 years old. Underlying the Missoula flood deposits are basalt, and that's also mapped just to the east. There's also, what you can see on this geologic map, which shows the Willamette running north to south and Lake Oswego over here just for reference. You can see a lot of faults. Those are the both dashed and solid line black lines on the map. The important thing to remember when you're thinking about faults is that there's kind of 3 statuses, I guess you would say, that we assign to them. Inactive being older than the Quaternary, so older than approximately 2 million years old. Recently active, which would be active within the Quaternary, so let's say sometime in the last 2 million years. Again, this is geologic time, so it's recent is relative. And then active faults are thought to be in the Holocene, which is roughly the last 11,000 years or so. So again, this map, the geologic map, shows all of the faults in the general area. The USGS maintains a database of all recently active and active faults, the Quaternary Fold and Fault database. And that is kind of a go-to resource that we consult when trying to assess the potential geologic hazards of a given site. The Oakfield Fault, which as we all know is mapped across the southwestern part of the site, is considered recently active in that it is thought to have, based on geologic evidence, not just at the project site, but along the 40-kilometer map trace of the Oakfield Fault, there is compelling geologic evidence that it has moved in the last 2 million or so years, but it is not considered an active fault at this time. And I think that's a perfect segue for the next slide, Brian. And I'll turn that over to Wes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is Wes Spang, principal engineer with GRI. So just to kind of continue on what Greg was talking about, you can see the site there in that little pink circle, the Oakfield Fault in green, and then the Portland Hills Fault is that blue line to the east. And a couple important things to note. I think, as we all know, the Portland Hills Fault is considered seismogenic, which means it is considered capable of generating earthquakes in today's environment. And the USGS has assigned that a maximum magnitude of about 7. However, if you look on the right, you'll see that the estimated return period for that magnitude is 14,000 years. So it's considered to be an extremely slow fault with respect to rupture times. Estimated probability of occurrence is less than 1% in 50 years. So although it is considered seismogenic, it's not considered to be a very high return period earthquake. The Oakfield Fault, as Greg just indicated, is not considered seismogenic. And in their latest USGS, United States Geological Survey, update of all faults that are included in what's called the probabilistic seismic hazard analysis that is used to develop building codes, levels of seismicity, shaking, et cetera, that Oakfield Fault is not included in the USGS database because of its lack of activity and age. Another fault not shown here that we're all aware of that is also included in building codes with respect to developing levels of seismic shaking is the Cascadia subduction zone, a potential magnitude 9 located offshore. Estimated return period is about 350 to 500 years. Again, that and the Portland Hills Fault, as we'll see, provide the main parameters that go into our building codes with respect to levels of seismic shaking that could be experienced at the site. I think we move on.
Great, thanks, Wes. So when we were thinking through how to most appropriately assess the Oakfield Fault at the site, before we went out and started digging up the lawn or anything, the first thing we did was a seismic-refraction geophysical survey. So that can basically be thought of as imaging the subsurface. The way it works is basically through a source and then receiver process. So they lay out a string of what are called geophones, which are the receiver, and then they create a source. In this case, they used a track-mounted hydraulic excavator and dropped a 300-pound weight on the ground, and they measure the compressional wave velocity from the source at the surface down into the subsurface and then back to the receivers. And so what that tells us basically is that harder, denser material, in this case, which we infer to be the bedrock, has a faster wave velocity and is shown in these warmer colors, the yellows, oranges, and reds. And softer, looser material, your silts, sands, that kind of stuff, is the cooler colors, the blues to greens. Now, these the images below, which I've annotated to show on the X, is roughly 230 feet or so of horizontal distance, and it images, in this particular case, about 75 feet down. And what we can see here, the take home, is that we see a harder, denser material with a very distinct offset, which is shown here where this softer, looser green and blue material is next to it. Okay, and that aligns convincingly with the mapped trace of the Oakfield Fault. And what that shows us is that there's a offset at depth in that underlying basalt material of down to the west, which agrees with our understanding of past fault movements of the Oakfield. So the two main things that the geophysical survey allow us to do is to kind of check whether we think the map is accurate. In this case, do we believe there is a fault there? Yes. And then it also allows us to refine where we're going to do these more invasive, in this case, trenching, test pit, physical elements of the investigation. So that was our next step after we had done the geophysical survey and could plan these test pits with a little bit more data to drive that decision making. To discuss the process and results of the test pit and trenches, I'll turn it over to George.
Thanks, Greg. Can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Good. Having a little bit of technical difficulties here, but so this figure shows in the left a vertical air photo view of the site. The green line represents the trace of the Oatfield Fault, and you can see in the upper right of the photo is where the school building itself is. Like Greg and Brian mentioned, we did 3 test pits, and test pits are explorations that are done with a backhoe to dig out a trench basically in the soil, and it allows us to take a look at the soil units and to look for evidence. In this case, we were very interested in seeing if there was any evidence of ruptured or broken sedimentary structures, anything that would look like it had been faulted. There were some constraints. We didn't want to tear up the playground and the asphalt, but we were able to locate 3 test pits. As you can see, those are the blue boxes, and one of them, test pit 2, actually crossed and coincided with that seismic line that Greg just showed, and approximately where the map trace of the Oatfield Fault is, again in green. And the bottom part of this photo is a series of pictures that show that particular trench, test pit 2, and we spent good amount of time carefully examining the soil units in the trench to really look to see if there was any kind of evidence of faulting or any place where we could see that the soil units were broken, these 15,000-year-old roughly soil units. And the good news for the site and for the project was we were able to see that there were continuous layering throughout that trench, throughout the area across over the fault. And what that means is that we can reasonably come to the conclusion that there's been no activity on the Oatfield Fault in the last 15,000 years at the Concord site. So with that, I think we'll go to the next slide.
Oh, sorry about that. I was muted there. Okay. So this slide, based on the results of what George has talked about, what we would then provide to the structural engineer for his analysis, his seismic analysis, both for retrofit of the existing structure as well as new structures, are various seismic parameters that Jared and the structural folks would use. The seismic code that is used for the design incorporates both the American Society of Civil Engineers ASCE 716 publication, and in Oregon we have a special code that we also use called the Oregon Structural Specialty Code. Both of those prescribe an analysis that is using what's called probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. So we develop the recommended seismic design parameters that are based on a level of shaking equating to a 2,475 year return period, or about 2% chance of probability in 50 years. And again, as George has said, there's no evidence that the Oatfield Fault has experienced any movement within 15,000 years, which is much, much greater than the design period of the building code of about 2,500 years. The contributing sources to the seismicity at the site, which the building code incorporates, include both the Portland Hills Fault and the Cascadia subduction zone, as we discussed earlier. Another issue that we do look at for these type of projects is other seismic hazards, such as liquefaction or cyclic softening. Again, the good news is that at this site, that is not an issue. And so really from the structural design, seismic design, these 2 buildings will be designed with conventional seismic parameters as produced by the building code. Okay. So in conclusion with what we've talked about here, the USGS maps the Oakfield Fault in the Southwest Project portion of the site as we talked about. The Oakfield Fault does not contribute to the seismic hazard for the USGS. In other words, it's considered non-seismogenic compared to, say, either the Portland Hills Fault or the Cascadia Subduction Zone. From what we have done at the site, it does appear to be there, but as George explained, the good news is there's no evidence of any rupture within 15,000 years, which makes it either non-seismic or of such low seismic activity that, again, the USGS does not consider it to be a source of seismicity in the Portland area. We would recommend, with the fact that the Oakfield Fault has been mapped in that southwest corner, that no structural development occur within at least 50 feet of the inferred trace. And in California, this is actually codified in what's called the Aqua Spriola zones. There is no similar guidelines in Oregon, but we think that that would be a best practice. And I think the good thing is that looking at where the proposed structures are and the existing structure and where the mapped Oakfield Fault is, we are at least 100 feet away, if not more like 150 feet away, putting us well beyond the distance of those guidelines, which again, I think is good practice and can be comfortable for everyone that there aren't any issues with respect to that type of activity here. And I think that's it. Is that another slide, Brian, or is that it?
That's it.
I think that's it, right?
So Catherine, we'll turn it back over to you, or will you be passing it over to Jared?
Let's pass it over to Jared.
Great.
So he can
Hooray.
tell us how you use this information.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great deal of technical information with all sorts of good news embedded, right? So we use geotechnical information really kind of two main ways. The first is GRI in this case has provided design criteria for all of the new and existing foundations. So we size a footing or footings based on criteria that the geotechnical engineer gives to us. So they've given us that information. It's actually quite good for the buildings that we're designing here in this case, and I don't think we have any big issues there. Then they also give us criteria for what we do to design the lateral forces in our building structures, which is what we've just gone through here. And the bottom line in this case is that there are no surprises. Everything is typical, which is essentially what Wes concluded there, in that we don't have anything special to consider related to the proximity of the Oakfield Fault. The foundation and demands in the lateral system are as we have expected to this point. So the recommendations that we've been providing have been substantiated by GRI's findings. And moving forward, I don't see anything that prevents us from continuing in the way that we've been going. So all good news, top to bottom. Way to go.
Jared, can you give us a reminder of where we are with how we're designing for seismic loads? You had that nice chart, the graphic that you were going to share.
Yeah. Do you? Oh, Jennifer's going to share. Great. Thanks, Jennifer.
This is just as a reminder for everyone.
Right. So, boy, I think it was about 6 months or so ago, we had a presentation that talked about, at that time, the Concord building and what we could do with the Concord building. And this was one of the slides that we presented. And if at that time, if you remember, we had some options that we could do very little, we could do a little bit more, and we could do a lot more. And that was options 1, 2, and 3. As we stand right now, with the option 2 addition that's been selected and we're moving forward with. And I'm sorry, the option 2 is in reference to the building addition option 2, where we're adding the gymnasium, library, and essentially doing some insertions into the existing building. That will trigger strengthening of the existing Concord building. And we will be looking at strengthening that building to meet that life safety objective at a minimum. And so as we dig further into the design with OPSIS and NCPRD and GRI and others, we'll be talking about options related to Concord and what we can do there. So essentially at this point, we're no longer able to leave the building as it is. We're going to be doing strengthening is the bottom line.
I do want to add, Jared, to the conversation that remember when we looked at this slide back, I think in early March, this was a conversation we had about the existing building alone. So the option 1 and option 2 had to do if you were just looking at the existing building. We were not looking at the additions on there yet. These were the 2 options we could consider. Now that we are further along and that we understand we're going to be doing additions and we're going to be interacting with the existing building, that means we're going to be affecting some of the existing structure. Therefore, the amount of work we need to do to that existing structure is elevated to the level that we have to bring everything, since we're touching it now with the renovation, we will be bringing everything up to the same standard. So that is that level 2. So it's a little misleading in this terminology because at the time we were looking at this slide, it was about just the building alone as a baseline. So now that we're doing things with it, that kind of ups the ante on what you have to do. Because once you touch the structure and you affect it, you then have to bring it up to current building code and seismic code.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
And if you have anything else to add to that, Jared, I don't know. I just wanted to make sure everybody was clear on that, what that means. So that means we'll be tying, maybe Jared, you want to explain what that means, what we'll be doing in.
Sure, yeah. So again, this is a little bit of a memory jog back to March, but the recommendations for the building, for the Concord only at that time, we had do nothing essentially. Tie in the existing unreinforced masonry walls using a series of metal studs, or do that and add shotcrete shear walls in and around the building in discrete locations to improve its behavior and performance. We're now into that level of strengthening of Concord building. So we are supporting the brick veneer or the unreinforced masonry and turning it into brick veneer, so it's no longer a falling and collapse hazard. And we are adding new concrete shear walls to supplement the capacity, the lateral capacity of the existing structure. So that's where we are right now. And just to tie this all back into GRI, we will be utilizing the results of GRI's 88-page report to design those elements. So the data that GRI has provided gives us criteria now to design those structural elements.
Thank you, everyone. So I think that's a lot of technical information, as Jared mentioned, and we've got more engineers in the room than you can possibly count. So if there are questions, this is a great time to ask them because as I've said before, I'm not the person to ask, but we've got all the right people in the room now that you can ask your questions of. Does anybody have a question? Just raise your hand. Grover, I didn't think you would have a question.
And besides that, I actually raised my hand in the little blue hand also. So
Oh, good job.
I did that one first. So my question, first of all, thank you. That was a great presentation. I feel like you adequately made it to a level that I understand, and I appreciate all the work that went into that. And it's good to know. The question I have is about the option 2 price tag, and this, what I just heard at the tail end here. So this means we're going to have to do yada yada to the other to the existing historic building, etc. Was that included in the $35,750,000
Yes,
guess?
yes, it was.
Okay, cool.
We priced option up to option 2 in that because we knew that we were going to be affecting the existing structure in that. So yes, that was included in there. Yeah.
Kudos to y'all. I just wanted to check that so I knew. And again, thanks for good presentation and great work.
Gary, go for it.
Find the unmute button. Okay, I was wanting to bring up a study that was done on the Clackamas County Courthouse in Oregon City about 5 years ago, I think it was. And they, in dealing with the soil conditions, which is very similar, it's not that far away actually, to where the Concord School is. It's just down the river, so to speak. They have the same kind of alluvial deposits and a basaltic base underneath that. This is 2011, excuse me, I said 5 years. But I'll just quote, it says, a 2011 site-specific seismic hazard study completed for a 3-story addition to the Clackamas County Courthouse found that the alluvium and fill material underlying the courthouse would likely experience soil liquefaction and/or significant settlement as a result of a major crustal or subduction zone earthquake. And they went on to say they recommended the foundation for the addition to be tied with pilings and piers to the basaltic bedrock underneath the surface fill on alluvium. And I just wondered, I think, I don't know who it was now, basically said liquefaction wouldn't be a problem at the Concord site. Anybody?
Yeah, I'll take that. This is Wes. The locations of the 2 buildings at the Concord site are on very shallow soils underlined by basalt. So there is no material. First of all, to have liquefaction, you've got to have, like you say, loose alluvial soils, and you've got to have groundwater. At the site where the buildings are, the soils, the alluvial soils there are very thin, they're not saturated. And then very quickly below that, within 10 to 15 feet, there's basalt material. So at this site, that is not an issue.
You're saying that the soils are a lot thinner at the Oregon City site?
No, the soils at our site, where the building are located, are very thin, like 5 to 10 feet. They're not saturated, and then we get into basalt rock.
Okay.
So that's not an issue at this site.
What would be the situation if you were in the middle of winter with lots of rain and then you had a subduction zone quake?
Well, still, no, that would not be a worry here at all.
Wes, I think there's probably people in the meeting that maybe aren't quite familiar with what liquefaction means. And I think it would be helpful to describe that maybe in simple terms and where you commonly see that. I know I've dealt with it on other projects, but they usually are maybe really close to the river or in areas like you described, but maybe it would help if you just explain that a little bit more for people.
Sure. So liquefaction is the term used when you have, and again, it can either be typically loose fill soils or alluvial soil. So materials that are not very dense, they have to be saturated, and then you have to have strong enough shaking. Basically what happens is the water pressure builds up in the soil to a condition where the soil liquefies, becomes very soft and unstable. In Portland area, that is a concern, but again, it's typically a concern along the riverfront, along valley areas where you have 20, 30, 40 feet of soil and a very shallow groundwater table that, again, is throughout the year. At this site where the buildings are located, there's a very shallow, little thin veneer of soil overlying dense basalt rock. So at this site, that's not an issue. Now, if you went a half mile to the west as you go towards the river, that clearly would be an issue. But at this site, that's not an issue.
Does that answer your question, Gary?
As best I can tell, I'm not a geologist. So.
I'd weigh in here and just say, Gary, I think the big difference between where the Clackamas County Courthouse is and the Concord site is just proximity to the river. And that's probably what's really creating the difference between the two sites that you're seeing there in those reports.
Well, I didn't delve into this. I didn't read far enough for the people here, but I believe that my memory serves me when I read this about 2-3 weeks ago. They were concerned about a lack of clay in the soil and not enough clay, I guess, to hold it together. I don't know if that's the situation at the Concord site or not, if it's more silty and sandy, less clay, or again, I'm not a soil engineer.
Well, you're right. I mean, the more clay you have, the less susceptible the soil is to liquefaction. And again, it's a bit of a moot point here, but the soil here, even the thin veneer of soil, is a very fine grained material. So again, it's not a sand like you get at, near a river where you've got more alluvial sandy deposits.
I have plenty of clay on my property. I'm willing to contribute to the project if any of you want that, because that's all I've got when I start digging in my yard. Mike Schmier is right next to me. You got the same thing, right, Mike?
Lots of clay, yeah. And it's about 4 feet deep, and then you hit the basalt.
Oh, I dug 7 into my clay trying to put in some drainage, and I didn't get any basalt, just clay.
I think, Mark, did you have your hand up? Mark Elliott?
I do, yeah, I do, yeah. If you can hear me okay. You know, I got several questions, if I may. Then we take a couple of minutes. And I think my questions really have to do around how we might be developing or creating the seismic design criteria for the project. And, there are a variety of different criteria that go into creating a design criteria for seismic resistance for the building. So, and I think one of my questions, has to do with to what degree might we be accumulating different criteria that might increase the seismic design criteria beyond what we might need to do, if that makes sense. In other words, if if you take, for instance, that the site classification, as I understand from the report, there's actually a couple, if you were to break this down, there might be more than one site classification for the site, right? Because part of it could be considered site class D, where we have really bad soil conditions, and even a site class B in areas where we might be building the building, right? So my first question has to do with about site classification. If you guys could maybe just clarify your understanding of the site classification.
This is Wes, I'll take that. So you're correct. Sites are classified based on their soil or geologic materials. Not to get too technical, they're based on the soil conditions or rock conditions to a depth of about 100 feet below the ground surface. A site class B is typically reserved for having rock material right at the ground surface. At this site where the buildings are, you saw the test pit photos that George showed, we've got soil, then we have residual soil, And if you saw that, if you remember that seismic refraction photo that, or cross section that Greg showed, we get into hard basalt, but not till somewhere around 40, 50, 60 feet. So based on that data and using those seismic velocities from the seismic refraction testing, this site, following the classification scheme that the building code requires, is a site class D. And so I believe that Jared has been using and will continue to use site class D for all his structural design.
Okay, great. That makes sense based on the depth of the soils. Okay, thank you.
Correct.
And the other question I have. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, if we had hammer ringing basalt right at the ground surface, then you might have a site class B or C. But we've got a thick enough soil profile. It's basalt, but it's highly weathered, and so that makes it classify as a D. Okay,
great. Thank you. And then as far as the occupancy classification for the site, how has that been determined so far?
Jennifer, you want to take this one?
Are you referring to the site specific classification?
No, it's related to, four different categories of occupancy classification. So you can assume that if this was a hospital, that would be one classification. If this was a residential single family home, or say even worse, if it was like an agricultural building, that would be the other side of that occupancy classification that would factor into the seismic design criteria for the building. So I'm just curious about what is the classification and how was that determined?
Well, you're picking my brain on something I'm not looking at right now, to be honest. And that's the kind of thing that we're going to get into as soon as we get into schematic design.
Okay, so I think my thought is here, Jennifer, and also Jared, is that if we look at the appropriate occupancy classification for this facility, and then we improve upon that by increasing our requirement for a life safety and above, to what degree are we compounding the requirements, structural requirements for the building and adding additional costs that may or may not be necessary? Yeah. My thought is that as we accumulate more seismic design and structural design requirements at a limited cost, we are going to have to reduce other parts of the budget in order to compensate for that. So my thought is there's a really delicate balance between making a selection of what criteria we're using for seismic and structural design and what that means as far as the balance of the money that's available to do other things in this facility, right? That's my thought.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid, Mark. I would say, so I was listening to you sort of talk about the differences between the occupancy category, and just for everybody's knowledge, what Mark's referring to is stipulations in the prescriptive building code. And so his example of a hospital is what we call an occupancy category 4 building. It's one that we don't want to have, large scale damage to, because we all want to be able to go and use it following a natural disaster, right? An earthquake, a tornado, that sort of thing. The other end of that spectrum is an occupancy category 1 building, which would be something that can sustain a lot of damage because it's not something that we're going to rely upon. And then there's occupancy category 2 and 3 in between. Occupancy category 2 would be your run-of-the-mill office building, and category 3 would be something that we place more importance on, but it doesn't become a critical care facility or a 911 call center or something like that. And in this case, Mark, just to answer your question directly, this building, because it's a school, would automatically fall into that occupancy category 3 scenario. And now we're modifying that into community center / library. And so we need to do a little bit of due diligence as we dig into the design and find out, well, are we still at that occupancy category 3 ratio as defined by code? Or, to your point, can that be relaxed, and could we look at just occupancy category 2? Those are things that we're going to be working with everybody here to sort of suss out as we break into design.
I mean, the nice thing.
okay, thank you.
The nice thing about the building previously being a school is that kind of lifts that that requirement was already there. So it does help us that our uses are similar, also that they do kind of have that higher standard. So
Right.
Jared and I have talked, we have talked about that as well.
So another one of my questions has to do, is that okay, Catherine?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I didn't know you had another one. Go ahead.
I actually have two more. So one is that the specific seismic hazard evaluation that you did, that's a code requirement based on the site classification D, right?
You mean the geotechnical site specific investigation, Mark?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, yes, is the simple answer. And then I think that there was also some interest in vetting out how impactful that Oatfield fault would be for this specific site.
So I guess my question is, do you happen to know what the difference is between the GRI recommendation versus the prescriptive site class D IBC requirement?
Yes, it's actually improved with GRI's report slightly. The site-specific criteria that GRI has developed is slightly better than what you can find using the USGS mapping.
So that would be an improvement as far as the seismic design resistance. Okay. And I think my final question has to do with the comment about this Cascadia subduction zone. So the reactions from that, are those now built into the IBC requirements as far as what we can anticipate the reaction is going to be here, even if it happens off the coast of the Oregon coast, right?
I'll say yes. I'm sure Wes would say yes too.
Yeah, let me just, like I said, I don't want to get too technical and bore you with a lot of earthquake engineering, but when the USGS and the building codes develop their maps and seismic parameters for basically every location in the area, they consider the depth of the distance to the fault. So in this case, the distance of the Cascadia subduction zone, the maximum magnitude, the return period, the soil conditions, and the duration of shaking. So yes, ever since the Cascadia subduction zone, became known 20, 25 years ago or so, the building codes have incorporated the effects of what an earthquake off the coast of Oregon would be in the Portland area. So yes, it is a part of and is a significant factor in the seismic contribution to the building code for any structure in the Portland area.
So Jared, if I could ask just one other quick question, if I may. So I think I am not up to speed on where the state of Oregon is in upgrading the seismic design requirements in the code. They're like, I would say they're pretty different in California than they are in Oregon. And if you were to look back about 2 code versions, we were pretty badly out of whack, I think, with what the seismic design criteria are for not only new buildings, but particularly existing buildings like this one. And so I know there's been a lot of work being done within the profession in the last few years to lobby the legislature to adopt stricter seismic design criteria for both existing and new buildings. So if you could speak to that for just a minute about where that is and what effect that's had on the current code. And I'm thinking we're using the 2018 version or whatever the OSSC version is, the most current one, right?
Mhm.
You could speak to that as far as where we are with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's fairly straightforward. For new buildings, it has to meet current code. Now we can always go above and beyond, but that the seismic design criteria in the International Building Code, which is what the Oregon Structural Specialty Code relies upon, essentially matches what is done in California for new buildings. There are some differences in California due to near fault issues there that we don't necessarily have here, but in all comparison, they're the same codes. When you get into existing building code, that's where we really differ. And Oregon has been doing a lot of work to sort of bring language into the existing building code that really addresses some shortcomings in how we deal with existing buildings. And the simple answer is we've now migrated Chapter 34 into the building code that has a great deal of language around how you address different modifications in existing buildings. And this is how we get to the place where we're doing enough modification in the existing Concord building that we will need to address the major deficiencies in that building. And that's codified. There's a pathway for us to deal with that. Now, the state of Oregon all relies on Chapter 34. And if we were in the city of Portland, we'd actually have a whole other slew of things to deal with that are actually even a little more stringent in how we address buildings, especially those that are unreinforced masonry. Now, we can certainly take our knowledge based on what is traditional and typical for an unreinforced masonry building and apply that here. We will get some better performance, but the reality is we have a code pathway and it does give us good language for getting better performance out of this building. The last thing I'd say, Mark, because you're probably familiar with it, Paul Bounty probably is as well, that we have other documentation that we get to utilize for existing buildings. It's a national code, ASCE 41, and ASCE 41 is a code specific to utilize for buildings that we are modifying that are existing. So we get to utilize the capacities, the residual capacities in existing buildings by using ASCE 41. And that gives us a pathway for actually recognizing existing capacity and pushing it to a place where we don't just have to ignore all of that old building material that we don't necessarily have a code pathway for. So we will be doing that in this case. And in fact, much of the strengthening scheme that we've developed for Concord already is based on ASCE 41. So. And hopefully that answered your question. It was a lot more words than you probably wanted.
Yeah. Did that answer your questions, Mark?
Yeah, it sure did. And I thank you guys. And I think as we get into the schematic design, I know there's a lot to look at there, and we'll know more about what we have to do and what we don't have to do. And I guess I appreciate that the design team will make sure that we know the difference between what we have to do and what we can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. For our guests here, you may have noticed we have a lot of expertise in the room. So thanks for all the questions. I noticed that Mike's hand has been up for a while, and then Grover next. Then after Mike, we'll do Grover.
Okay, well, thanks. My question has absolutely nothing to do with the seismic activity on the site, but I am the history guy. And so Greg, I have a question for you. When you were doing your trenching, you did 3 trenches. By any chance, did you run across any evidence of an old school building built in 1910? It would have been like trench 2, I think.
We did not. No, we didn't see any sort of anomalous kind of fill type material. Everything we uncovered in the trenches appeared natural. It was sand, silt, clay, and then basalt at depth. No, we didn't find any historical information.
I was just dying of curiosity because I know the second building on the site, the first one being in 1890, was right by Concord Road. The second one was behind it quite a few yards, maybe 100 to 200 feet further behind it. That'd be to the north, closer to where your trench 2 was. And I know it had a basement, so I was just curious. Yeah, why don't you go back? Why don't you go back and do more digging? I'm dying to know if you find it.
Well, there's a playground and a parking lot and all kinds of stuff in the way.
We'll be doing more digging soon.
That's all.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. How about you, Grover? You have another question?
I do. And I really, thanks for Mark's questions because they brought up a previous conversation that we have had. And that's my interest in having the ability, if there was, not like a hospital, but if there was a disaster, this is being, at least in the minds of many, considered the community center. In which case, if there was a disaster and it did affect many of the people in the surrounds, when you say this is an occupancy, I don't know if they're zone 3, class 3 or whatever, but a 3, which would be what I heard you say, as opposed to a 4, which is a hospital. I want to know how it plays out as a community center as far as that. And then I heard the other discussion about that we are required to do certain things, but not other things, because the code says we have to do this, and I want to really know about safety, again, from that perspective of this likely to be, 5-10 years from now, it will be a community center and a place. And so I'd be repeating myself if I went on from there, but those are my questions. Thanks. Oh, I did have one other piece, and that was the part about when you start talking about what goes on in Portland and just the general safety of brick buildings. So are we going to be addressing all of that about flying bricks and collapsing bricks, et cetera, in all, because like in the hotel downtown on Broadway, they built a whole nother building inside of the building and then strapped it all and yada, yada. Okay, I will listen quietly. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll answer your second question first, just because I give myself whiplash nodding my head. Yes, we're definitely going to be strapping, basically anchoring all of that existing unreinforced masonry back into the building structure and dragging it out in an effective load path that prevents it from A, collapsing, and B, becoming a falling hazard for occupants. So as to your question about occupancy category 3 versus 4 and what you could do with the building. So we have to remember that the building code is a floor, not a ceiling, and that it's a minimum. And so we get to decide based on what's possible budgetarily from a schedule perspective, what we can do with this building, what performance we want out of this building. And so, Grover, I know that we've had conversations about the potential for what I'm going to call an emergency shelter. We can call it any number of things, but if that's what you're getting at, yes, that is an option we can look at. Now, I think early on we talked about that as the original, or with somewhere within the existing Concord building. Now that we're potentially adding this gymnasium, it might make sense to have that conversation around what's the best square footage to do that in and what's the goal. So again, no decisions are being made right now. I think that that's something to put on the table as further discussion and understand as a basis of design, right? I think it's a totally valid thing to talk about. Definitely, let's talk about that early, not late in the design process, because that would have significant modifications. So good that you brought it up now. Catherine will put it down on the agenda going forward.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at that in schematic design for sure.
Yeah.
I do have a question. I've been meaning to, now that I have all this expertise in the room or on the screen, I'm not familiar. Grover's asking about essentially a a place where people can go in the event of an earthquake event, and gather and be safe. And it's, you know, and I guess in Mark's world, in the hospital world, it would be called an essential facility. And I'm not aware of other buildings that have been built to accommodate where communities could go to be safe. Usually it's, you know, the police, the police station because you want to keep your police safe, hospital because you want to, you know, have doctors and emergency equipments and patients safe. But I don't know of any community gathering space that's an essential facility. And I'm wondering if any of you all know of one. Jared, you're nodding your head.
Well, yeah, I think in general, Catherine, that is definitely something that is newer to the built environment as a concept, right? And, you know, you could look up resiliency, you know, do a web search on resiliency and you will find lots of conversation about that, but it's in general a topic that is, it takes a lot of coordination. It's not just building structure, it's services, it's everything you can think of about how to make resilient buildings. I say all that because there is actually statewide grant funding offered for making emergency shelter space, you know, and specifically for doing so by upgrading K-12 schools. So what you will find is most recently, there are a lot of existing gymnasiums in schools around the state that have been going through this upgrade, this voluntary seismic upgrade, to make them essentially a shelter space. Now, I don't know if there's anything nearby. I don't know about, you know, maybe Clackamas High School has one. I don't know if a map even exists for something like that. So I only know about it because of the schools that we have done, but we haven't worked in and around or nearby Concord. So I don't know how to answer that part of the question.
Oh, that's good. I didn't know that. I mean, now that you remind me, I think you told me that before, but
yeah, that's okay. Well, I mentioned the grant funding. The SRG,
yeah, you did, right. And it makes sense that.
And that's something that I think we'll bring up as we go, as we take this conversation further. I think we talk about that.
Okay, okay, good, thanks.
So Catherine, I think the other thing I'm aware of is that sometimes essential facilities are defined that way in order to serve the community, not so much to be a house or a home for them in the event of a major catastrophe. When I lived in California for 20 years, I can tell you that, you know, it was drilled into our heads by the American Red Cross over and over again that every person needed to be able to take care of themselves for up to 10 days before anyone came to help them. And that means water and food and medical supplies. And so I don't think that the state of Oregon is as aware of that situation as much as perhaps those in San Francisco are. So I realize that there's a value in you know, creating some kind of a place where people can go. I can tell you from the work I've done with the Army Corps of Engineers, it's not just the building that they look at, but they look at the water source. And if you're taking water in, it has to go somewhere. And that water has to go into something down the drain to somewhere. And so you get into all kinds of different systems, including power and water and waste, if you're really going to have a facility that's going to take care of people for any period of time. So, you know, I just mentioned that it gets complicated and it gets expensive.
You know, I would add on, Catherine, that I think the conversation around this particular project is good. It really does need to involve emergency planners because that's who's going to actually, do the majority of the administering of said emergency event. I mean, and to Mark's point, there's lots and lots and lots of aspects that have to be considered well beyond just the structure. The structure is actually the easy part. I'll just say that.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good reminder, because Mitzi and I won't be the primary responders.
Neither will I. I'm going to be holed up, and I like Mark's 10 days, but I can pretty much guarantee you that's probably more like 6 weeks in Oregon, because we don't have a lot of earthquakes and we're really unprepared. So.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any other hands up in the chat room. Any final questions for our guests? Okay. Oh, Grover.
Yeah,
It's your
and it
last
isn't
one,
really
yeah.
so much for our guests. I just want to make sure it gets carried forward, because I really appreciate the conversation that many people have contributed to here. But the idea that does Clackamas County, and we're in the middle of a pandemic and how much preparation. So if we're looking at the subduction zone piece, how many shelter qualifying or essential qualifying structures are there in the county? And somebody alluded to, we should count them. So county people, please do proceed to follow up with that. And the other part is, I do believe there's been discussion, and we don't have to have the conversation now, but that in this community center, there'll be the opportunity, like they do in libraries elsewhere, to have on Tuesday, I'm making up the dates, but on Tuesdays, there'll be a clinic staff be there for people, because it is a distance for people to travel to go to the existing county and or other facilities. And in our little corridor here, there's nothing. So to be able to include that and incorporate that, I don't know if that changes to make it an essential or not. I don't need to decide that now, but I do want to keep it within the conversation that we go forward on. So thanks.
Okay. So I think what we'll do now is open it up for public comment. We do have a few people in the audience, and maybe Amber, you can help me with this, or Ellen.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
I got there. Go ahead.
Okay. So if anybody has public comments, you in the Zoom function, you can go ahead and just use the raise your hand feature to let us know that you would like to comment. I don't see anybody calling in, but if you were on the phone, you would just dial *9. And I don't see any hands going up.
All right. Okay, hearing none. Rose just signed off. She wanted to, she wrote it to everyone. Thank you, experts. Looking forward to schematic design phase. I need to sign off. Rose is also a developer. We have a lot of expertise here. So I think if there are no other questions, we're gonna close 15 minutes early. That's a record for us. And we can all go and enjoy the evening. I'll kick it back to Doug for some closing comments.
All right, well, thanks, Catherine. Thanks. Wow, what a team. I'm always impressed to be in the company of people who really know what the heck they're talking about. And especially the gift of being able to present that to those of us who don't know what we're talking about, and make us feel like we understand things better than we did before we met. So hope you all gained at least as much as I did from this discussion. Thanks to those of you who had some great questions. It helped our experts clarify some things for us, because I think that'll help us continue to be an informed task force. Moving forward, we've got another meeting in 2 weeks, November 12th, where Jennifer and company will be presenting their final report, which will be then going from there to the commissioners. So we'll get to hear what they've come up with, and that should be pretty exciting to see. It's going to be kind of the icing on the cake in a sense. Although of course we go from there on to schematic, there's lots of work to be done, but it's kind of wrapping up this stage of things. Mike, I see you. Go ahead.
Is it that next meeting, is that going to be a Zoom meeting like this, or is it just basically going to be a webinar where we sit and listen?
It's gonna be your house, Mike. I thought we kind of clarified
That's fine,
that.
no problem.
You got a big yard. You've got a big yard. We can
Yeah.
also we can all be
Yeah,
at
we
least
can
6 feet
spread
apart.
out back there, yeah. Uh-huh.
It should be the same format as our previous meetings have been, as my understanding.
Oh, okay.
What were you thinking, Mike? Were you thinking?
Well, isn't it a policy session, a BCC policy session?
No, so we actually have a task force meeting before that. So
Oh,
you will be reviewing the draft report before it goes to the BCC with your recommendation.
Yeah,
I'll send out all the notice next week. It's a week from next Thursday.
Okay,
or
I'm
2
just
weeks
a
from
worry
tonight.
wart, I just worry about everything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, well-
Catherine, I think you did outline this, but you will all be getting a physical copy, a draft copy to read before the meeting. So you have a chance to look at it, bring questions, bring comments. The purpose of the meeting is really to listen to your comments and to talk through, to make sure that we've tracked the comments and that we have a good footing for starting in the next phase. So.
Yeah, we'll be sending out hard copies that will land on your doorstep next week.
Excellent. Something to look forward to.
Yeah.
A sneak preview.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, again, thanks everybody. Nice to see you all. Do take care. I don't know what to expect out of trick or treating, but enjoy the full moon for whatever it brings, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Scott,
Great
by the way,
meeting.
Scott, I will just as chair, I do want to say, Scott, thank you so much for your participation in all this as well.
Thank you, Doug.
It's meant a lot. It's been a lot to me, and I'm sure to others, to have you representing NCPRD and contributing to all this. Thumbs up even from Mike Schmier, which those are hard.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah. Best of
appreciate
luck
that.
to you going forward.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.